Should I put him in my lap? Do you think that would be a...
That's not creepy at all.
Yeah, we'll sit right next to him. Well, thank you for joining me up here, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess first, let's just get started by you telling me what about VR got you excited originally? What really appealed to you with the industry?
It's cliche at this point, but the minute you strap that on, you realize that this is a thing, and it's a medium that is here to stay. It is the inversion of so much of the kind of hype we've been inundated with over the last 10, 15 years with emerging technologies. And I think that one of the biggest data points for us early on was the number of creators, content creators, filmmakers, showrunners, writers, producers, cinematographers who wanted to jump into the deep end of the pool and create. And so we hadn't seen that kind of magnetism, if you will, in a generation. And so the amount of activity that's coming from that side of the house has been a bit like drinking from a fire hose, which is a positive thing.
Absolutely. I mean, the enthusiasm is it's infectious. You know, there's just so many people getting involved, and a lot of people are, you know, taking existing content and adapting it for VR, or they're you know, creating something brand new. And I think a lot of people would agree that things that are created from the ground up with VR in mind tend to utilize the medium the best. And so what do you think are the main areas that a content creator should pay attention to when they're creating something for VR?
Well, you know, we're exploring both buckets of activity, right? So we have an extremely aggressive, immersive, on-tone, first-person shooter VR game based on our John Wick property. And it's a sub-narrative to the core narrative, which is the impossible task. And if you remember from the film, he was assigned an impossible task, which was a story told within the body of the film, and then we explore that as its own discrete VR vehicle. So although it is based on an existing piece of IP, it is very much its own vehicle. And I think the thing that is most impressive internally and externally is how involved the filmmakers are in the game. So they, just as acute as they were with the film with regard to making sure he reloaded those guns when he ran out of bullets, they're doing the same exact thing in the game. So there's no getting cute. It's very pragmatic, and it absolutely continues the tone, you know, that is John Wick. And then at the same time, we have 2 or 3 greenlit projects that are original IPs that will be, again, discrete commercial VR vehicles that we're extremely excited about, and we have tremendous talent involved, both, you know, in front of the camera, if you will, as well as directing and writing.
Whenever it comes to VR products, I think they're making games get even more interactive. And one big buzzword a lot of people throw around is cinematic. And so I guess with the way that VR is evolving over time, games are getting involved there. But what do you think movies have to learn from the game industry? Since games have sort of adapted some of the lessons they've seen in film, what can films do to learn from the game industry?
Well, I think all mediums learn from one another. It is such an immersive experience. I mean, some of the games, the horror-themed games, are horrifying. I mean, literally have to rip that thing off your head as fast as you can.
In VR, no one can see you cry.
Yeah, they saw me cry, and it wasn't pretty. But I think the collaboration, and again, it's this unprecedented, at least in my experience, appetite of the creators to play with the medium. And I think, yeah, the games have become more cinematic because of the computation power, the ability to tell a larger narrative, the engagement metrics of the consuming constituency are so great that you have to give them more story. You have to give them more backstory. You have to have a portfolio of characters if you want to be a certain type of game. So I think there's a lot of borrowing back and forth, and you see now television writers and film writers getting involved in the games business in an unprecedented way. And then you see, you know, there are games creators that are now, you know, looking at creating cinematic pieces in VR and even in more traditional forms of film and television. So there's more crossover now than ever.
Speaking of that crossover, it's an interesting question. You know, how do you Is there a line anymore between what is a film, a traditional movie, what is a game? Those two things, the line's getting blurrier and blurrier as they become more crossover and more streamlined together. And so from your perspective at a company like Lionsgate, where you deal so heavily in both, how do you approach a project and decide whether it would be a best fit for a film or a game? Where is that line? How do you even decide between the two?
We have been there 2 years, and very early determination was we're going to treat our games business like a business. And so we go out and source developers from all over the world. And it's the same exercise we go through for choosing a film director or a showrunner in television. You want a developer and a publisher that has a passion for that IP. They have the acumen to bring that IP to life. And in success, that game could live a very long time. So you want to make sure that the chemistry between yourselves and them is also in sync. So I think that is one of the big differentiators in today's marketplace, because the economics on the game side, in particular, when there is IP at stake, are now substantive enough that they command that kind of attention. And they command the kind of resources from companies like ours to take that business seriously.
And from a consumer perspective, the way that people interact and consume a game versus a movie is now, even more similar, especially as films go into VR and there are more VR games. And so if, a 360 video versus an interactive environment like a game, how do you decide how do you navigate the waters of those two different sorts of mediums that are so closely related together?
Well, we like most of our brethren, we have a big initiative with our marketing and promotion vehicles based on some of our biggest IPs. And what a great way to bring attention to a nascent market like VR. It's a rising tide. So when you can put out a promotional or marketing vehicle based on a Hunger Games or a Nerve most recently, or a Divergent, that does nothing but good for everyone involved. At the same time, you need to be able to follow that up with more robust commercial vehicles, because therein does not lie a business. So you have to make a business out of it. So I think there are varying degrees of, this is my master's degree in the obvious, but of sophistication with the products that are available. So you have products for the hardest core of gamers, and you now have products for the more casual kind of social consumer. And again, I think that's a sign of the health of this emerging space.
And alluding to those other experiences you mentioned, the Hunger Games, Nerve, and those sort of cinematic VR, bite-sized experiences, how do you see things like that scaling over time for VR? Because I know a big concern is just the amount of time someone spends inside of a headset. There's a lot of caution around that right now, not wanting to make things too long. So how do you see that scaling over time? Do you think we're going to have full-length feature films in VR, for example, with 360 footage for the entire 2-hour experience, or do you think the medium's going to adapt to the medium itself?
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, right? So there's we're motivated to say, of course, that will be the case. I mean, we were the first, I think, if not the first or second, to do an EST, electronic sell-through and video-on-demand deal with Oculus, for example, for full-length feature films and television shows. And so, as everyone here knows, if you're in these conversations, there's a lot of A/B testing going on with formats and length. The technology is getting better by the day. We're not a technology company, we're a content company, we're an IP-driven company, so there are folks, like Roy, who just left the stage, that could probably speak to the computation power and the calibration that, again, seems to be improving by the day. So I think we're less concerned about the ability to introduce longer formats into the environment. We're acutely focused right now on making sure that the install base is there. We're managing expectations because we're very bullish on the medium. We're less aggressive on the timeline, right? So we want to make sure that we're in a cadence with how the market is picking up the product.
Whenever I guess whenever you're deciding between a TV show or a film or anything like that, whenever you're adapting that into VR, do you see a way for that to become more integrated with the game industry in a way? Because I know in the past we've seen experiments with movies or games that would run simultaneously or concurrently together. There'd be some overlap between franchises. I think Sci-Fi had Defiance, which was like an MMO and a TV show at the same time. So with how VR is so immersive and it really puts people inside the world, do you think that we'll ever see anything like that again with VR, where there's intimate overlap between properties like that?
We do. I mean, we hope, right? So that was with Tryon, that partnership, I believe,
Yeah.
with Sci-Fi and Tryon. And again, great shot on goal, right? I mean, we love that people are putting their necks out there. So, we're an investor in Telltale Games, for example, at Lionsgate, and they are their own genre of gaming, if you will. And I can't tell you the amount of developers that come through our halls that say, we're going to be the Telltale of VR. And I'm like, nah, I think Telltale is going to be the Telltale of VR. But it's companies like that and others that are out there that I think they are so narrative driven. They are so great at telling stories within their games. And that's a very natural leap for them to get into more standardized, longer formats. They've talked about the super show concept, for example, where there would be accompanying, longer form content, with games product, and VR would slip very nicely into that. So we're, again, it's we're bullish on it, but we want to make sure that we're not getting out over our skis.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you brought up a great point as far as the way that the content is so much more immersive for the consumer and for the viewer, the way they interact with it. So whenever it comes to designing an experience for VR from a Lionsgate perspective, where you have so many of those different stakeholders, you have so many different options in the industry, how do you approach a property and decide how it'll be interactive for the user for VR? Because even a 360 film, the way you design that is different than a traditional film or a TV show. And so how do you approach that from a design perspective or a filming perspective?
I think one of the decisions we made early on, right or wrong, it was just a decision we made, was we're going to work with as many developers as possible, in particular in the early stages, and we're not going to put our eggs in one or two baskets. And so in the dozen to 15 VR projects we have going, we're probably working with 11 individual partners. And that list is growing. So again, it's similar to finding a director on a theatrical project or a showrunner for a television project. You want to make sure that there's a vision, and again, that they have the ability to execute against that vision. And we have the advantage of having some great IP that's extremely attractive to developers and publishers. And even, as these platforms are emerging, we're seeing unprecedented investment from those in the ecosystem, which is, again, nothing but great, because it gives us more opportunity to take more shots on goal.
Absolutely. And with a portfolio so large and working with so many different studios, from your perspective, should someone look for in a content studio, if they're from an investment perspective? Should they look for someone that just has the ambition to do something that's just crazy beyond anything we've seen before? Should they look for someone with past experience that they're adapting into VR? How from an investment perspective, what do you think companies should look for whenever they're talking with studios?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think for us, I think all the studios have a slightly different mandate as they look at investing. Ours is pretty straightforward, and it comes on high from our CEO, which I holistically agree with. Also, he's my boss, so of course I'm going to agree with him. But everything has to be very obviously strategic to what we're doing. So again, we don't want to have to explain it to your investors, right? You don't want to have to explain it to your peers. There are other media companies who have sidecar funds where they are treating that activity in a much more traditional venture role, and we're not, right? So the companies that we're getting involved with, whether it's Next Games out of Helsinki or Fifth Journey out of Hong Kong or Telltale out of San Rafael, it is about making sure that there's commercial traction. Or even when we got involved with Mob Crush, it was about, we're huge believers in this space, and it was a great way for us to get really far upstream with a great team, and got a lot of insight into what was happening in that particular space. So, I think for us, knock on wood, in the 2 years and the bets that we've made, we haven't had to do a lot of that explaining. So, when companies do come in and present, and we meet with a lot of them, I would say first and foremost, it's got to be a very obvious strategic fit.
Great. I think that's some excellent insight for sure. I think we have a few minutes left here if you want to answer some questions from the audience.
Happy to, if there are any. Or we could just sit here awkwardly.
Hi, Nicole Zara from Zio Design, and I was curious in terms of VR, what kinds of properties work best? Do you think what has the biggest opportunity? You have many genres, that your company does. What do you think is the real sweet spot for the first generation of VR?
I don't think I heard the question perfectly. Sorry.
In terms of you have Lionsgate has a number of different genres.
Yep.
Which genres or which type of experiences do you believe will map the best or are the low-hanging fruit for developing into VR properties?
Got it. I think for us, because of, we have 16,000 titles in our library, so we have a lot to play with. But some of the more recent titles, and whether that's, again, Divergent or Hunger Games or Nerve, upcoming Power Rangers, Now You See Me, these are very kind of zeitgeisty, popular culture titles that are a lot of fun within these environments. So I think we look for, we're definitely not going to try to cram a square peg in a round hole. So we're not going to try to create VR experiences based on everything that's coming down the pike. That being said, you'd be surprised at some of the wildly creative pitches that come our way, based on some of our library content, things like Cube, for example, and Expendables. And so, it's not a perfect science, and we have a lot of fun making that determination. And part of that exercise is also, if a pitch comes in and it is left of center, but it's from a developer that's super passionate about it, and they have just, come up, they built a better mousetrap than you'd heard before. We're as likely to pursue that as probably some of the more obvious stuff that you could think of.
Thank you.
I think we might have time for one more if anyone else has a question.
Hey, so I'm wondering if there's a place where we can access some of the content that you guys are creating, because I'm not really familiar with some of the VR experiences that you do have. And if so, what are they, or what are you most excited about, and where can we get them?
So Gear VR, we've got several of our products up. Our first-person shooter John Wick game will launch initially at the end of the fourth quarter on Vive, and then it will be across all platforms. We have a Now You See Me VR title that's out mobile. Gear VR, that'll be forthcoming. So we're trying to address it at both ends of the spectrum, appealing again to some of the hardcore gamers with the Vive platform, PlayStation, and a lot of energy being spent right now on location-based entertainment. We're part of that announcement between Starbreeze and IMAX, and then at the same time, we want to make sure that we're reaching as many people as possible. So the mobile environments, you can find a lot of our product, and you will going forward. So we have a bunch of messaging coming out the next couple of months on a handful of projects that we're excited about.
All right, great. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with me, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.